Welcome, everyone. Another in our series, Exploring the Soul. Tonight, we're going to cover a whole range of different ideas connected with the soul, and hopefully bring a fuller picture to what we have been talking about. So we start tonight that we talked a lot about the soul. We've talked about the source of the concept of the soul in the creation of man and woman in the story of Bereshit. And I just want to bring other elements in, especially about our prayer and our daily service. So I'm going to bring in just three examples that we begin the day by saying, Moda ani lefanecha, melech chai v'kayam shechazarta bi nishmati, v'chem l'rabba emunatecha. That we give thanks to Hashem for returning our soul. This is the first thing we say in the morning. So this is very significant because right in the beginning of the morning, we're connecting to the fact that we have a soul and that God in his great mercy returns the soul to us, because when we're asleep, the sages say it's 1/60th of death, and there's no guarantee that you're going to wake up in the morning. For people who are younger, or when we were all young, you don't even think about that. But as we get older, there is this idea that people, what's called, die in their sleep. So every morning when we say it, of course, we say it every day and it's pretty automatic, but it certainly is, there's no guarantee that we're going to wake up in the morning. So that's the first thing we do, is we thank God that we have a soul. And then just a few minutes later in the morning blessings, so we say, Elokai neshama shenatata bi tahorahi. God, the soul that you have given me is pure. And we continue, but here again, right in the morning, we are relating to the fact that we have a soul. And as we've mentioned before, each person should ask himself, am I a body that has a soul, or am I a soul that has a body? It might sound like, what's the difference? But there's a huge difference as to how we perceive our whole being in this world. Are we primarily a body that is being kept alive by a soul? Or are we a soul that has a body which allows it to function in this world? So we really lean towards, we're a soul that has a body. We're going to get to it later, but in the last week's class, we focused primarily on what's called the powers and the garments of the soul. Probably most of you were here, but just in case someone was not, based on the book Anatomy of the Soul that we've been following from Rav Ginsburg. If we want to really analyze or understand the soul, then we look at the powers of the soul and the garments. The garments mean, how does the soul express itself? If there were no garments, if there were no vessels, then the soul, in a sense, would have no way to express itself. It would be in a state of pure potential. So last week we spent a good amount of time discussing the garments of the soul, which are thought, speech, and action. We're not going to go back over it. Hopefully everyone is on the WhatsApp, and so all of this information and all of the recordings are there for everyone. But the three garments of the soul are thought, speech, and action. That's how the soul expresses itself. Tonight, we're going to go more into the powers of the soul. But I want to add many, many other small ideas to try to fill out our picture of the soul. So one of the major ideas in Judaism is that the soul is eternal. Now, this is also not a given because not everyone believes this. Not everyone lives their life that way. Many people feel when we die, that's it. It's just blank, darkness, the grave, that's it. That is not Jewish belief. Jewish belief is that the soul lives on a different plane of consciousness, a different dimension. But there is, in a sense, death is really death of the body, but not of the soul. So that's, I mean, we might take that as a given, but if you took a survey of the whole world, not everyone believes that. And so that is important to understand. And we can see that in a number of ways. One is the mourning customs that we have. There's a whole set of Jewish law that when we lose 7 close relatives, then there's different types of mourning periods, different customs, different laws. And we assume that it's for us to be able to deal with the loss of a loved one. That is absolutely true. The psychology of the mourning practices are so right on, they're so deep, they're so solid to help us through a period of loss and the transition. But sometimes we forget that the mourning practices that we're doing is also for the departed soul. That the departed soul is still somewhat connected to this world. And this is especially true with saying Kaddish. Again, we relate to saying Kaddish as a comfort to ourselves. But according to the Gemara, according to the sages, really the ultimate purpose of Kaddish is to help the soul. The soul is no longer in this world, but that doesn't mean that the soul is done with. The soul is eternal. So our saying Kaddish, our sitting in Shiva, doing Shiva, our giving tzedakah in the name of a person who's passed away, our dedicating our learning to someone who's passed away, or contributing money to a cause in the name of a person who's passed away, we're told that this has a direct effect on the soul that is departed. So but the assumption behind it is that the soul is eternal. This leads us to another idea. And many of these ideas, of course, we could dedicate a whole class to the whole idea of what happens to the soul after it leaves this world. That's not the purpose right now. But the other concept, which is obviously connected to the eternity of the soul, is the idea of reincarnation, of Gilgul. Because if there was no eternity of the soul, you can't even talk about reincarnation. As in a sense, there'd be no soul to reincarnate. So the whole idea of reincarnation, which is a huge subject in of itself, I'm just mentioning that, again, it's based on our belief in the eternity of the soul, that the soul will return and fix whatever it has to fix, complete what it has to complete, contribute to one's family or community or all of Israel, many different reasons why we reincarnate. But again, the idea is the eternity of the soul. And then one last thing is the idea of the world to come. Because if there was no eternity of the soul, then there's nothing to talk about a world to come. That's why it says in Pirkei Avot that this world is like a corridor to the world to come. And we're told that everything we're doing in this world, the ultimate reward is only in the world to come. And yet, the sages say, don't be like someone who serves their master in order to get a reward. So this is a very, very fine, subtle line here, because on one hand, we have a very strong belief that the true reward for all of our actions in this world is this state of reality or consciousness called the world to come. But on the other hand, we're told that's not why we should be doing things in this world. We should be doing things in this world because it's the right thing to do, that it helps the world. We're not doing it for the reward. So that's the famous statement of the Alter Rebbe, who said, Ribbono Sh'olam, I don't want your reward. I don't want your world to come. I want you. That's what I want. I want you. And not in a future time. I want you right now. I want to be united with you. I want to be conscious of you. I want to cling to you, devekut. So all these things we just mentioned, obviously each one is a whole series in itself. But we can see from our morning practices, from the idea of reincarnation and the idea of the world to come, that our premise is that the soul lives on. I might have told this story before. It's an awesome story of the Friedeker Rebbe, that when he was still in Russia, so he was constantly in trouble with the authorities. At one point, he had a death sentence upon him. And the story is that at one of the investigations or grillings, the Russian officer put a pistol to his head. And the Rebbe just stood there. And the officer said, "Aren't you afraid?" And he said, someone who has one world and two gods would be afraid. But someone who has one God and two worlds, there's nothing to be afraid of. Like, awesome answer. Awesome answer. With a gun to his head. Okay, so there's also an idea given over in the Zohar and also taught in Chassidut that when a tzaddik leaves this world, his power in this world becomes even greater. Why? Because the tzaddik no longer has the physical limitations of a body, of a very finite physical material world. And the soul can actually have as much or more influence after it leaves this world. So there's many, many examples. I'm just going to pick three that people are probably aware of. I'll just do it in chronological order, is Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. During his life, he had a limited amount of students, of followers. At the height, I think I read once there was maybe 1,000 followers of Rabbi Nachman. And he had tremendous opposition to him during his lifetime, tremendous. And after he passed away, if it wasn't for his top student, Rabbi Natan, it's very debatable if the movement would have even lasted. And now, even during Corona, there were 30,000 people in Uman for Rosh Hashanah. So you can see his influence has increased dramatically over the years, dramatically. The other one, of course, is the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away 27 years ago. And if people remember, the first year or two, there were many articles written, can the Chabad movement survive the passing of the Rebbe? Many articles were written like this. The amazing thing is, in the last 27 years, the institutions of Chabad have tripled in size. It's like not to be believed. It's not to be believed. Chabad is everywhere. And so the idea, though, is it's all coming from the influence of the Rebbe from a different dimension. The other example really is Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, that he also, even though he had many, many people he influenced, but what we now know is Carlebach davening, it wasn't all over the world. Carlebach davening was where Reb Shlomo was davening. It wasn't like congregations all over the world were davening like Reb Shlomo. And of course, since he's left this world, everywhere, there's Carlebach davening everywhere. And even if you don't call it that, the influence of his way of davening has spread literally around the world. So this is just the idea of that when the soul leaves this world, it doesn't mean that it's still not connected. And in fact, that's one of the whole secrets of when Avram buries Sarah. We can't go very deep into it, but right after he buries Sarah, the verse says, "Va'avraham zaken ba biyamim, v'Hashem beirach et Avram bakol." Avram became wise in age, and he came into days, and God blessed Avram with everything. So one of the explanations, what does it mean he came into days? Because he was so connected to Sarah, now that she was in the other world, he came into days because he was so connected to her. He had one foot in this world and one foot in the world to come. His consciousness incorporated the soul of Sarah, even though she was not in this world anymore. And that's one of the explanations of Chevron. Chevron comes from the word chibur, connection. And so we're told that Chevron represents the connection between souls in this world and in the world to come. Okay, so today was Rosh Chodesh Sivan. In fact, many people are watching. It is still Rosh Chodesh Sivan, and here it is for another 15, 20 minutes. And so in the morning prayers on every Rosh Chodesh, we say the 104th Psalm. This is special for Rosh Chodesh, and it's called Borchi Nafshi et Hashem. So there's an amazing teaching about this. I'm going to read it to you in English. It comes from Tractate Barachot, page 10a. And the sages point out that in the 103rd and 104th Psalm, David HaMelech 5 different times says, Borachi nafshi et Hashem. My soul should bless you, Hashem. Porchi nafshi et Hashem. So listen what the Gemara says. Again, the question is posed, why is it repeated 5 times? So this is what the Gemara says. To whom did David refer in these 5 verses, beginning with, bless God, O my soul, Borachi nafshi et Hashem? He was alluding only to the Holy One, blessed be He, and to the soul. Just as the Holy One, blessed be He, fills the whole world, so the soul fills the body. Just as the Holy One, blessed be He, sees, but is not seen, so the soul sees, but is not seen. Just as the Holy One, blessed be He, feeds the whole world, so the soul feeds the whole body. Just as the Holy One, blessed be He, is pure, so the soul is pure. Just as the Holy One, blessed be He, abides in the innermost chambers, so the soul abides in the innermost chambers. Now listen what the sages say at the end. They say, let that which has these 5 qualities come and praise Him who has these 5 qualities. So I'm going to review this again. I'm going to review it again. What are the 5 things? This is a very important Gemara. Extremely important, because we began this whole series right from the beginning with the idea that a human being is created in the image of God. It's the only creation that has that quality, even though everything that exists, from the smallest atom to the largest galaxy and everything in between, everything has a spark of God animating it, or it could not exist. Whether it's a tree, or it's water, or it's a rock, or it's an animal, or a bird, or a mountain, whatever it is, it only exists because there is a spark of God animating it and giving it life, giving it existence. The soul is different. The soul is created in the image and likeness of God. So this Gemara really gets into specifics. So if we're created in the image of God, so what's the comparisons? How are we compared to God? So this is just such a beautiful Gemara. So the 5 things in the order is that just like God fills the whole world, the soul fills the body. Just as God sees and is not seen, God sees and is not seen. Just like God nourishes the entire world, so the soul nourishes the body. Just as God is pure, so the soul is pure. That's what we said. We say it every morning. Elokai neshama shenatata bi tahorahi. God, the soul you have given me is pure. And the last one is, just like God, as it were, dwells in the inner chambers, meaning God is very hidden. God is immanent in everything, in every point of space, in every moment of time is godliness. And yet God is totally hidden. So is the soul. The soul is very hidden, and yet it expresses itself, as we were saying, through the garments of the soul. So these are the 5 things. Now, of course, it's interesting that according to the ancient midrash that we've mentioned many times in Breshit Rabbah, the soul is called by 5 names. So the exact order that the Gemara gives over these 5 comparisons, these relate to the 5 ascending levels of the soul. The soul that fills the body is the nefesh, because we've identified the nefesh as the part of the soul, the closest clinging to the body. Sees and is not seen. This is the ruach. This is the emotional component of the soul. Nourishes the body. So this is the neshama. Is pure. This is the chaya, the living soul. And the aspect of dwelling in the inner chamber, this is the yechida. This is the unique spark of God within the soul that's very hidden, very, very hidden. So this is just an amazing, amazing Gemara. I'm going to say Beli Neder. I'll try to post this on a whole chart, so it'll be very clear for everyone on the WhatsApp on Thursday, Bezrat Hashem. But there's one other thing here, what Rav Ginsburg would call a mathematical gem. So, Borchi Nafshi et Hashem, that phrase or verse equals 1099. So what does that mean? Listen to this. This is like classic. If you just take the 5 names of the soul, Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yechida, they equal 1099. So we say, Borchi Nafshi et Hashem, that my soul should praise Hashem. It's means with all 5 levels of the soul. So this becomes an amazing meditation. Just to meditate on these 4 words, Borchi Nafshi et Hashem, and then to think about how this relates to my nefesh, my ruach, my neshama, my chaya, and my yechida. So that's classic. Beli Neder, I will try to post this for everyone to see the whole idea here. Okay, now I want to go to the powers of the soul. Last week, we actually reviewed the powers of the soul, and we saw that they're divided into 2. There's the transcendent powers of the soul and the immanent powers of the soul. And what we said, that the most important thing to remember and realize that the powers of the soul are the sphirot. This is very, very important. We had a whole series about the sphirot. And what we said over and over again, the sphirot, just like every letter in the Torah, manifests itself in worlds, souls, and divinity. The sphirot also manifest themselves in every level of the physical material world, on every level of the soul, and are emanations of God's light and energy into this world. This is what we've talked about: worlds, souls, and divinity. So when we had the series on the Sphirot, we most certainly spent a good amount of time trying to understand the Sphirot as they relate to the soul connection to the Sphirot. But here, we're putting a different word, and that's called the powers of the soul. And since we have spent an extensive time on the Sphirot, and again, people who are on the WhatsApp, anyone who needs review, everything's been posted, and people can get all of the reviews. So just very shortly, because we did this last week, so I don't want to dwell extensively, but it's just important to understand that when we talk about Chachma, Bina, and Dat, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, these are not just words, these are the powers of the soul. And then we get into the lower Sphirot. Let me start from the top. I'm going to go back. The transcendent levels of the soul are in Keter, the crown. And as we've discussed many times, this is faith, pleasure, and will. These are all-encompassing powers of the soul, that they encompass everything about us, but they're called transcendent because they're like hovering. They need to be brought down into this world, into our intellect and into our emotions and into our behavior. And that is the flow of the Sefirot. We go and we take faith, pleasure, and will, and then we bring them down into the Chachma, Bina, and Dat, which is the intellect. And then the intellect needs to rule over the emotions. This, of course, are Chesed, Gevura, Tiferet. And even more concrete are the behavioristic, instinctual levels of the soul. And that's Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchut. So the Sefirot, there's a flow. This is the week of Malchut. Malchut, everything of all of the Sefirot flow into Malchut. Really, Yesod and Malchut. Yesod is the funnel, and it's all flowing into Malchut. So that's why I'll just mention we've been counting Sefirot Omer for almost 7 weeks now. And each week, we have to draw it further and further into action. And that's why Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchut, they take Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferet, which are more emotions, and we translate it into expressions of those emotions. So now I want to do something a bit unique here. And that is that in Kabbalah and Hasidut, it's not mentioned that often, but it's mentioned enough that along with the 10 Sefirot, there's also what's called the 10 Sefirot of Klippa, or the other side. Now, this is a little bit surprising, but it shouldn't be, because we have a pasuk that says, Zeh le'umat zeh asa Elokim. This against this God has made. And this is the main verse about how everything has an equal and opposite side. The whole world is our dualities are equal and opposite. And so almost everything in this world is somewhat neutral. It all depends on how it's used. The computer, it's not good and it's not bad, but it can be used for the good or it can be used for the bad. And we can go through almost anything in life. It depends on how you apply or you use different energies. And this is played out in the story in the Torah about Bilam. And the Midrash says that the nations of the world came to God and said, if you would give us a prophet on the level of Moshe Rabbeinu, we also could be your chosen people. We also might listen to you. So God says, okay, I'll give you Bilam. So Bilam had unbelievable power. We should not think otherwise. The prophecies of Bilam, he gave 4 series of prophecies. The last one was what would be in the future. And exactly what he said, the later prophets confirmed. He was connected but he wanted to curse. And he wanted to live a life of immorality. So I'm going to go through very, very quickly. It's a very, very interesting idea, but it's very practical. I'm going to go through the 10 sfirot and just mention, well, what happens if this sphera is not used for the good? Or it just, the good potential, the positive potential is not realized. What could the ramifications be? And there are many different ways we could do it. This is just one version. But let's start with Keter. And we know that Keter is transcendent. So being connected to the transcendent nature of God, of course, is an incredible thing, to be connected to the transcendent powers of the soul. But it also, the expression, someone has their head in the clouds and their feet are not on the ground. So this power of the soul, if it's not channeled correctly, and I think everyone knows people, what is it called? The absent-minded professor, right? The brilliant genius who barely knows how to tie their shoes. It's just in the world of academia or science or their profession, they're masters, but in the rest of their life, they're a mess. So that's this idea. If transcendent is phenomenal potential power. But again, what happens if it's not applied correctly? Let's go to Chachma. Chachma is this idea of flashes of insight. So again, probably every invention in the world came from one of these flashes. And then, of course, we bring it into Bina and it's developed. But what happens if we're just constantly flashing on things and we don't have the ability to take it to the next step? That could lead to a lot of confusion. That could lead to a lot of psychological problems. Again, I'm going to this very, very quickly just to give a picture, because the powers of the soul need to be developed. They need to be actualized. They need to be refined. And if we don't, they either remain in total potential and for all practical purposes are inactive, or what I'm trying to describe is they could lead us to negative consequences. So in Bina, so we know that Bina comes from the word to build. And so Bina takes the general flashes of Chachma and builds through particulars a living being, just like Bina is called the mother. And so the mother gives birth and nourishes the fetus for 9 months. But what happens, and again, we all know ourselves and other people who are too particular, people who become perfectionists to the point that they drive everyone else crazy and themselves, because every particular has to be perfect. And if it's not, they're terribly bothered, and they can't let anyone get by who is not perfect. So this is an example of where a power of the soul, if not properly refined and addressed, can lead to a negative kind of thing. Dat is knowledge. This is an easy one. Everyone knows people who are know-it-alls, people who act, and their whole attitude is, I know everything. No one can tell me anything. So that's it. So that's when Dat goes awry. Chesed is loving kindness. But what happens when loving kindness has no borders? So here we'll call it, again, just so we can relate to it, we'll call it the movement of free love in the 60s. This was a real attitude that people had, not just an attitude. People acted out this, especially sexually. And probably most people had good intentions, like, wow, it's a world of love, but there were no borders. There was no refinement then. And so many people got really, really burned through this. So here's chesed. What could be better than chesed, than loving kindness? But when it's too unbridled, it's too no borders whatsoever, it's not a positive thing. Gevura is judgment, order, strength. These are tremendously wonderful things. We couldn't exist without them. But what happens when a person is too harsh with other people, too harsh with themselves, too judgmental? So again, these are powers of the soul that, if we're not careful, can lead us to not good places. Tiferet is all about holism, harmony. So we could say, well, what could be bad about that? The inner dimension of Tiferet is rachamim, compassion. Compassion is, we're told that we should emulate God. And one of the main things they say is, just like God is compassionate, we should be compassionate. But what do the sages say? That someone who is compassionate upon the cruel will end up being cruel to the compassionate. So in other words, even though we might say compassion should be no strings attached, well, that's not exactly true. That's not exactly true. That if someone is not a worthy recipient and is going to misuse your compassion to be cruel to someone else, that's not compassion. So here's just another example. Netzach is, one of the meanings of netzach is to orchestrate. So here, that's such a wonderful thing. We have so much going on in our lives. We need to make balance. We need to know how to orchestrate all the different parts of our life. But what happens when we become a power freak? What happens when we become bossy? And we take this power. We have the ability to put things together, but we don't do it in a nice way. We don't empower other people. We just use it to boss other people around. When we get to Hod, one of the many meanings of Hod is confession, lahodot, vidui. There's many meanings of Hod. Again, I'm doing this very, very quickly. One of the meanings of Hod is to confess. That's one of the ingredients of doing tshuva. It's an absolute must. But what happens when confession turns into constant guilt? That one, no matter how many times confesses doing something wrong, is saddled with this ongoing feeling of guilt and low self-esteem, because they can't get out of the cycle of guilt. Yesod is always connected to sexuality. It's connected to many things, but it's always connected to sexuality. Sexuality, again, is one of the prime things that, when used in a proper way, it is considered one of the highest spiritual acts. But when it's not, then it becomes connected to really violence and the lowest of the low. It can descend to the lowest of the low. And the last one is Malchut. Malchut is, we're said that Malchut has nothing of its own. It's the receptacle of all the energies come in, and then the energies come in, and the idea is kingship, it's leadership. And of course, this is vital, but we're told that the inner dimension is shiflut, is a sense of existential lowliness. Like it says, Moshe was the most humble person on the face of the earth. And David HaMelech, maybe the most powerful king, he was in a constant state of existential lowliness. But what happens when that existential lowliness turns into low self-esteem? Existential lowliness does not mean low self-esteem. It just means a realistic understanding of who we are as human beings and our relationship with the creator of the universe. But sometimes people translate humbleness or shiflut into being a floor mat for other people. That's not what it means. That's when it goes awry. So we just went through all of the sfirot, and it's important because if we're going to talk about the powers of the soul, then we have to know if the powers are not being used right, if they're being channeled in wrong directions. And that's really what we've been doing through Sfirot Omer with the lower 7 Sfirot. The lower 7 Sfirot, we've been trying to fix and rectify and purify and refine and improve, because these powers, if not used properly, that's what we say in the Kavanah, that on the merit of counting Sfirot Omer today, I should be able to repair any blemish in, let's say today is Tiferet Sheba Malchut, meaning that if the powers of the soul are not used properly, then it leads to problems. Okay, so I think that's really as far as we can take it tonight. And we will not be meeting before Shavuot. So I just want to bless everyone with a inspiring and meaningful Shavuot. We should really live in the present and understand that the Torah is being given on a constant basis, and it's not a one-time event in the past, and that this Shavuot we can all rededicate ourselves, renew ourselves, and reconnect to the inspiration of the Torah.